Um, all right. Well, it's just about time now for our last talk of the day and the last talk of the conference, which I feel like just flew by. We saved a great one for last as well. So I want to welcome Anthony Majin and Audrey Chen Liu from UC Irvine, right? Yes, to go ahead and get us started.
Mm, Yeah, thanks so much for inviting us. One of the things as you think about preparing a TA program is one thing that you would be like the classroom teaching, but one thing you might not be thinking about is how do you give them feedback? I know some of us are already thinking about that, but that's one part that's been a little bit understudied. And so a project that I'm really interested in is how do we provide effective written feedback to our students and how do we train our TAs to do that better? And so this project started off as a BIioTAP project, and since then, we started thinking about what are cultural backgrounds that could actually act as psychosocial factors that actually modify the effectiveness of how some written instructor feedback is. So I'm going to let Anthony take it away.
Hello, everybody. My name is Anthony. So for this project, we did look over a variety of cultures, mostly individualism and collectivism cultures, focusing on these four categories that we got from Triandes and Gelfand's Individualism and Collectivism Orientation Scale from 1998. So with these four categories, they're kind of a spectrum of individualism and collectivism. Horizontal individualism is this pattern of self-reliance. So these are individuals who want to be distinct from another and are more likely to say or agree with phrases like, I want to do my own thing, compared to vertical individualism, which is a pattern of self-distinction from people, not uniqueness. They are more likely to agree with phrases that say, I want to be the best, right? Horizontal collectivism is a pattern of valuing equality of people within the group, but not necessarily freedom of the group that they are in. So they do find similarities between people. They emphasize sociability, but they do not easily follow authority or ideologies that the group has. Compare that to vertical collectivism. It is a pattern of putting the group's needs over one's own. So the people who follow this cultural orientation are more likely to support the in-group, often sacrificing their own ideologies to agree with that of the in-group. So with this project, we did focus on a lot of different types of styles of feedback, but the one that we did have a good focus on was directive versus facilitative feedback. Directive feedback is just a form of explicit feedback. So with this type of feedback, it identifies what needs to be fixed, what needs to be revised, telling the student like what they did wrong and how they can improve or correct on their work to meet their expected standards. Facilitative feedback is just how we can help students guide them towards the desired performance level. So not necessarily telling them what to fix, but any of the comments, suggestions are more there to help students guide and revise their work instead of telling them change this in your work or change that. It does not explicitly say what to fix.
So we set out with two research questions. One was, how is written instructor feedback on a biology lab report perceived differently by students either from an individualistic or collectivist background? And then, what's the most effective way to actually formulate feedback for students from one of these cultures? To do this, we started off with a survey. The survey was given out to all first-year biology students, and we had 71 respondents. And in the survey, we asked about their perceptions of authority, and we want to understand their cultural orientation level. So we used the validated questions that Trinidas and Gelfand had already published and identified where they were on their cultural orientation. And then from that, we recruited students who were interested in sharing more about their thoughts. In this 30 to 35-minute Zoom interview, we basically gave them different samples of instructor feedback, and they might have been different, for example, in facilitative versus directive feedback, or they might have been different in terms of what pronouns were used. So pronouns in this case were like, were they I, you should do this, or were they we, like plural first person pronouns where it's like, let's look at this. We can. And we basically gave these samples to the students as how they perceived them, which one they liked better. And we also wanted to look at whether or not there were ideas of culture and family that might have influenced their perception or how they utilized the feedback. And one of the findings we found was that students with low vertical collectivist levels were more likely to prefer positive feedback. So remember, these are the students who basically would not want to sacrifice for the group. They're the same students from our data that's actually people who wanted feedback that acknowledged something that they did well. They were not so interested in feedback that offered resources or aid, and they're also not people who prefer feedback that just identified weaknesses.
So we also found that students with higher vertical individualism levels, so these are the students who try to have a self-distinction, but not necessarily a uniqueness from one another. These students are more likely to use written feedback from a professor. So when we say this, it's not saying there is a preferential seekness of feedback. When students were presented with either TA or professor feedback, the professor's feedback was more likely utilized, but that did not define their preference from where they seek feedback. And during our interview, we did give the students, again, sample responses of instructor feedback. So for this feedback, the student was presented with a style that where it was not explicitly stated and the use of the first person plural pronouns like we and you were more, where like we were more emphasized, I'm sorry. And it didn't necessarily concretely say what to change. So Hillary was a student. She's a first-year biology student with Asian descent who scored high in horizontal individualism and horizontal collectivism, and the other orientation level she scored moderate. So she stated that she likes the little details of the response. Let's work on and when we look at the page. And it invites this more collaborative space with the inviting language. So the inviting language is important for students like Hillary since it created that atmosphere that invited her for collaboration. And also, we also found that when presented students with a more direct style of feedback, explicitly stated, telling them what to do or change, students with collectivist cultural backgrounds also did value this over the facilitative feedback. So Callie is a first-year student with Asian descent who scored moderate on all orientation levels, but did score or more leaning towards horizontal collectivism. She said that for the directive style of feedback, she likes how it's very straightforward. It gets to the point on what to fix, how we can work on it to fix that, and how to go about that. She did mention that for the facilitative feedback, she still appreciated the use of like collaboration words, but she just liked the directive feedback more. And then looking into like the student TA professor relationship, we did find that students did kind of relate those roles towards that of a family. So Victor was one of these students. He was a first year, first generation student with Mexican and Native American descent who scored moderately across all cultural orientation levels, but did lean a little more towards vertical collectivism. He did state that the professor is kind of like this daunting or scary person to talk to in the classroom, relating them to the head of the household, and a TA is more like of a sister or brother type of figure. So for Victor, students like Victor, they related the professor to the head of a classroom, much like a parent figure is more of the head of the household. So it gave the professor this kind of sense of authority, and it gave Victor that sort of familiarity to it, where he kind of like saw that as how the professor would act as well. With that, we did see that cultural background and the family dynamics did influence how people interact with others. So how students interacted with the instructor, whether that be a TA or a professor. And it is relevant to past findings, which have shown like great power distance relationships in collectivist cultures. So a greater sense of like authority in the student-teacher relationship.
So to kind of summarize some of the things that we found that students with low vertical collectivism levels are actually more likely to prefer that positive feedback, while students with a high vertical individualism level were more likely to use written feedback from a professor than a teaching assistant. It didn't affect whether or not they sought out uh, feedback from either professor or teaching. They didn't show preferences for that. But in terms of utilization, they did prefer the professor's feedback over a TA. And the other thing is we saw that some students with a collectivist cultural background value directive feedback over facilitative feedback. They also really value that sense of collaboration. So overall, it made us realize that delivering effective feedback is much more complex than we originally thought. And these cultural orientations do affect also like the student interaction with either the TA or with the faculty member. And it does modify the type of communication and the way they're perceiving the feedback from their instructor, whether the instructor is a TA or whether the instructor is a professor. So in terms of future directions, we really want to be able to look at other frameworks besides using the Trinidad and Gelfand framework. We're interested in looking at cultures in terms of those that are high power or low power. So when there's a greater difference between status and that's really valued, does that actually also add another layer of a cultural background that changes the way that students interact with TAs or professors, or how they're perceiving the feedback from one or the other. We're also really interested in looking at high context versus low context cultures. So that's the difference between a low context culture would be one where it's very much focused on the explicit, like this was actually stated in the text of the words, versus in high context, it's about the implicit things, about the environment, about all these things that are unsaid but perceived. And we realized that those things could also affect how communication, in this case, written instructor feedback, is actually perceived by a student and how that could be different depending on the cultural background of the students. In our further analysis, we also want to interlay intersectional identities and be able to see whether or not we can have better trends if we actually had a little bit more specificity with that, and in terms of looking at that, where they might be multiple identities. So for some of the demographics, that does require us to recruit more individuals. So we definitely want to increase the number of first-year biology students that we want to recruit into our study. In order to do this analysis, but also to get a full spectrum of cultural backgrounds. A lot of the current people that we have recruited were basically moderate in a lot of their cultural orientations. And so we want to be able to also look at the people who are leaning more towards either one within the spectrum, and to see how that's actually influencing how they receive feedback. So this work would not be done with a lot of people's work. Actually, Anthony was the one who came with me with this idea of looking at different cultural orientations based on what Trinidad and Gelfand had looked at. Elise was a person who started off the project and looked at what are standards that we can have when we try to actually aim for really great, effective instructor feedback. And Sergio and Leslie are two students who are continuing this project. A lot of this is because of conversations I've had with Kapod, which is like our pod group that we named after for a small group of people within BIioTAP that actually help me think about the psychosocial factors. We want to thank the entire BIioTAP network, as well as all the undergrads who participate in this particular study. Yeah, so happy to have any questions, very happy to have collaborations. And here's our contact info. So we'd love to like stay in touch and keep bouncing ideas off, as well as start collaborations, or if you want to help recruit students. I just saw Adam's question in the chat. So he's thinking he was there at my talk at BioTAP's virtual conference last year, and he remembered it. It was about like this rubric that this is mostly Elise's work, about actually establishing a rubric that was validated through experts, as well as we did some usability testing with graduate students. Like, does this rubric actually make sense? And his question is, are there ways this new work has informed that project? So when we went back and looked at the rubric, one of the things that I was particularly interested in is like, when did we talk about facilitative feedback and directive feedback? And when you looked at that, that was actually under the mastery. So one of the levels was looking at mastery of formative feedback. And under the rubric, it was that it needed both. You needed both directive and facilitative feedback. That would have been ideal. And I think what this project is making me think about is that I wonder if the ratio is different depending on different cultural groups. Um, the work that we did on single versus plural pronouns, that one is something that was not actually like part of the rubric, but something that we started thinking about as just like, oh, what could be a difference between people from a collectivist versus individualist culture. That's not in the rubric, like hardcore in yet. Would it fit in a place somewhere? Um, I would love people's thoughts on that. What I'm not sure is whether this like taints everything within the rubric or whether it's like an additional level within. There are surprising a lot of things that don't seem like they're going to change within the rubric, but there's also some things that I feel like we could provide better guidance for if considering we do know like the cultural background of people or can suggest potential things to consider. There might be variability in how you give feedback. Please be careful with this one. I'm still thinking a lot about it and I don't have good answers is basically the short answer.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. This is definitely really fascinating, something I hadn't really thought a whole lot about. So I'd be curious to see how that ends up for you. Anyone have any thoughts or questions or further comments for Audrey and Anthony? I see. Yeah, go ahead, Beth.
I want to commend the work, first of all, because it's entirely original and fascinating, and also makes me just lose my mind in thinking about all the things I've probably written on papers before that have been interpreted in entirely offensive ways, perhaps, which is really it extends the things that we're thinking about in classroom dynamics so in such an interesting way, because of course these types of interactions would occur in our feedback as well. And so I will be interested, because now I'm like freaking out about, is there any generic way that that we can give feedback that which is exactly what you were thinking about, like if we know this is bad and we know this is bad, maybe there's like a medium kind of thread that we can go, because the idea that we would be able to identify everybody's in cultural preferences in this way is just, my head is hurting. All this to say, really, really good work.
Yeah, definitely. There's some tension there. And when we're thinking about training our grad students, right, having them think about all of these things and keeping that in mind while they're trying to be new educators, that's definitely a very interesting thing to consider for sure. But that's great.
It's interesting though, because I've never thought about like what sort of orientation I might have too. And this like building awareness of like how you're reacting and why you're reacting, and how, might also be an interesting kind of take on it, because it's all about, raising awareness of how we interact with each other. And I don't know, so fascinating.
Yeah, some of the work looking at high context versus low context is about like looking at the two players in this communication and when there's differences and when there's similarities and how that changes the communication. So that would be like another layer of complexity, which I don't think we're going to tackle in the next 2 years for sure.
Yeah. Intersectional identities too, intersectional aspects of identity can dig into the nuance of what constitutes good feedback. Yeah, good point, Adam. group interactions might be really interesting. Yeah. And Frank is asking about a link to your feedback rubric. Would that be something that might inform TA lab report grading?
Yeah, happy to share the rubric. It's unpublished at this point, so just email me and I can send it out to you. But it's in pre-publication form right now.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much. Oh, wait, we do have one more question. Good feedback. Well, good feedback, and then what someone actually does with it. There are preferences for how folks want feedback delivered, but I wonder if there are probabilities as to how people reflect and move forward using that feedback.
Yeah, so we haven't looked at metacognition for sure. In terms of how we've looked at feedback, we have looked at their perception of the feedback, and we have looked at in another study their utilization of the feedback. So if an instructor if instructor gave some feedback, did that feedback actually get incorporated into their second revision? So I haven't yet looked at like the reflections and I guess a little bit of how they move forward.
Thank you so much for answering that. I just I had to get that out. It was on my mind and I'm trying to listen and type, so I didn't know if the question was going to make sense.